clear. You could see down as much as 200 feet in it. But what I saw down there were two UFOs parked side by side, but I couldn't see anyone around either one of them. Then a little later, someone moved one of the UFO occupants, and I guess go ahead and call him what they are, the alien, moved over to the side and came into my line of sight. Very soon after that, he came out of the water going approximately 100 miles an hour. As soon as he broke the surface of the water, he increased his speed to approximately 2,500 miles an hour and quickly went out of sight. He was gone for about 15 or 20 minutes. He came right back, when it slowed down very much, went in the water again at about 100 miles an hour, went on down and he and the other one, you could see them working on the UFOs. They, after about approximately 2 hours of apparently performing maintenance on the UFOs, the two of them took off together again. We left the water at about 100 miles an hour, immediately accelerated to well over 2,500 miles an hour, went virtually straight up and disappeared.
The evidence you're about to review is some of the best in this field of study. The consistencies of these stories to many of what we've learned from today are remarkable, to say the least. Keep in mind, at the time of these clips being released, the U.S. government had claimed they were all masterful fabrications by the people coming forward.
Different species here. I'm aware of more now. As a matter of fact, I saw a document just a few days ago that mentioned 20. And I think you, Mr. Chairman, were interested in some of the places they might come from. And I have in here Zeta Reticuli, R-E-T-I-C-U-L-I, Reticuli, the Pleiades, Orion, Andromeda, and the Altair star systems. So I don't think we can any more refer to them as they, because they're not an amorphous mass. They are different species and consequently may have different agendas. I don't think we can say that they all have the same agenda any more than we could say that the United States, China, and Russia had the same agenda. Our real interests may be very similar, but as of now, our perceived interests are still quite far apart. The other species that I learned about not too long ago was called the tall whites. And this is when Paula Harris broke the story just a few years ago. And through her good offices, I had the chance to talk for about 3 hours with former Airman Charles Hall and listen to this absolutely fascinating story of how he was working with, first of all, he was scared out of his skin. But after that, when he got to know them, how he was working with, and finally they became to trust each other and have a good working relationship with the tall whites at the gunnery range at Indian Springs in Nevada. And these tall whites were living on United States Air Force property and working in cooperation with the United States Air Force and sharing technology.
What was the size of the staff working on Project Galileo?
Well, there were 22 people employed there totally.
And that was specifically for the Galileo project?
No, for the entire project. There were 22 people with majestic clearance. I had majestic clearance. Majestic clearance was designated as clearance 38 levels above Q clearance, and Q clearance is the civilian top secret clearance.
When did you see your first disc?
The first disc I saw, I believe it was the second, or I think it was the third time I was up there. Normally the bus pulled around to the opposite end of the facility, which was the main entrance, and That's where we went in. On this particular occasion, it pulled up to one of the hangar doors, which were normally closed, and the last one was open. We came out, and I saw the disc in the hangar. Upon seeing it, it struck me that, well, this explains all the UFO sightings. Not thinking that it was an extraterrestrial craft, that this must have been some advanced form of fighter that we've been working on for years, and, you know, people have just caught it being tested, so on and so forth. And it never even occurred to me, even though I was looking at an extraterrestrial vehicle, that, you know, this wasn't man-made.
When did you realize the craft was not of earthly origin?
Well, it probably really hit me when I got inside the craft and looked around and began to understand how the craft was operated, and finally grasped the whole project as a whole, as what we were doing, the fact that we weren't building this thing, we were trying to find out how it was made. We were back engineering it.
What is back engineering?
Well, back engineering is taking a finished product and finding out how the device or product was produced, and essentially determining whether or not you can duplicate it.
Now, scientists aside, what was your emotional response? What were you thinking were the implications to the world or man in general from these revelations?
I really didn't think about implications of that sort. As far as emotionally, people have asserted that, boy, that must have been the most exciting time in your life, and that's not the way it was. When I first got to look inside the craft, all I can say, it's an ominous feeling. You walk in there, and it feels as if you shouldn't be there. I know that sounds kind of corny, but it's a real ominous feeling. It's not an exciting feeling. It brings up a whole lot of questions in your mind. Well, where did this come from? And you know that they won't give you the answers to the whole story, but it's that's the only way I can describe it. It produces a gravity wave, which is similar to the gravity wave that the Earth produces. However, the craft phase shifts the wave. In other words, it turns the wave not really in an opposite polarity, but something to that effect, where it will work against the natural gravity wave of the Earth, and it produces lift in that effect.
Is there any internal protection for the crew? Does the craft generate a gravitational field inside the craft itself?
Well, the craft generates its own gravitational field. Being inside that field essentially doesn't shield you, but essentially you're in, and this is a terrible way to say it, almost in a different realm, because you're now influenced only by that gravitational field. For instance, people wonder how a craft like this can make a turn at such high speed, a 90-degree turn, when they would imagine people slamming up against the wall or something to that effect. Well, that really wouldn't happen. Inertia would have no effect. You're in a distortion, and don't forget that gravity distorts time and space, so really nothing is going to influence you while you're in there.
Describe the gravity amplifiers for us and some of their different operating configurations.
There are 3 amplifiers. The craft can operate on a single one, can lift off the ground. The way in which it's propelled are 2 different ways. There's what they call Omicron configuration, where the craft is using one generator, or Delta configuration, where it's utilizing all 3. Delta configuration would be for space travel. Essentially, the craft will tilt up on its side, as opposed to a science fiction movie where you see a flying saucer moving around. The craft will tilt up on its side, focus the 3 gravity generators to a single point, and move through space that way. Moving around the source of gravity is a problem to a disk because it's interference, essentially. So what they do is they work with that interference to their benefit. They'll use one gravity generator to lift the craft off the ground. And as opposed to what we're used to, for instance, a plane, once it's in the air, we envision thrust or some force coming out the back of it to push it forward. The crafts work completely opposite of that. What they do is once they're hovering in the air, they'll swing the two remaining gravity generators up in front of them and create a distortion, essentially a downhill, and the craft rolls downhill for infinity. It's always chasing a little distortion. That's why they look goofy when they fly around at low speed, because they're essentially, and any time you run over, the gravity field around the Earth is not completely constant and stable, depending on the minerals and density of the Earth underneath it. The gravity will vary somewhat, and you will get odd movements of the craft. So its low-speed mode is kind of unstable for the most part. I only witnessed one test flight up close, officially. That I was just inside the hangar. The test was going off probably just as the sun was going down, and it was a low-performance test. I believe there were some pilots or test pilots in the craft. The craft must have been retrofitted to fit them, because the seating arrangements were really not accommodating. They were in radio communication with the craft, which is kind of surprising to me, because the gravity waves that the craft was producing should have distorted the radio waves also. So apparently there's something there that I don't understand. The craft lifted off the ground, virtually noiseless, other than a small corona discharge on the bottom of the craft, indicating the presence of high voltage. That dissipated at about 30 feet, and it stood there completely silently, and moved over to the left and to the right, and sat back down. That was the entire test. However, that was an extremely impressive test. Maybe to someone that really knows little about science or anything, that wouldn't be a whole lot, but you have to realize this craft was about 52 feet in diameter. I don't know exactly how much it weighed, but it weighed a lot. And this was quite a scientific feat, to lift something completely silently, under control.
Of a craft. In fact, so close that you can see the occupants. It is 100% real, and I was there as that was filmed.
Okay, that's what I wanted to hear. I wanted to know.
Up on my website. Unfortunately, the one that's the depiction that's up there is not as clear as the other footage I have, and we're going to switch it soon. The one I have is the clearest footage of it. Also, I think the audience would like to know that footage was taken by the Cirrus UFO organization to a university in Istanbul, and their optical physicists went over that with a fine-tooth comb, and it was on all the major television broadcasts in Turkey that was the real McCoy. There was no faking. There was no trickery of the camera. There was not an aberration. There was not a frisbee. It talked about the reflected light off of the craft, which was coming from the full moon, and that the areas where you see the occupants are some kind of a backlighting.
Okay, now you said you were there when this was filmed. How close did this thing get to you and whoever else was there observing it?
Not as close as you might see from the footage. We were on the beach and filming out over the water. And what we saw is something bright that was under the moon. So let's say the moon was the size of a dime. This would have been the size of a flashlight. And we were more interested at that point in the moon than the little bright light that was under it. But the camera that we were using had a 400 millimeter lens on it and an electronic doubler. So as we pushed on the craft, which means focused or on the craft, it got more clear and more clear and more clear. And when we centered on it, those are the shots that became famous.
Were you astounded when you saw the video?
Oh yeah, you can hear us. The exclamations being made. It's up on YouTube. It's been up for some time, but you can hear the exclamations made both in Turkish and in English for those of us that were standing there, because we were looking at it on the monitor for the camera.
How many people were there?
Oh, at that point we must have had between 6 and 8 people.
Lies are some of the most powerful components that make up our characters as humans. All of us are able to do it at any time and for quite literally any reason. One has to wonder about the truth we've seen exposed today on the UAP phenomena from the powers that be, compared to when these people first came forward with their stories. The truth that comes from lying is once trust is lost, it may never be given again. I want to leave you with a clip of Mr. Lazar speaking on genetic alterations claimed to have been made on mankind to produce what we've come to be today as the human race.
These beings have historically interacted with man. How? What was involved there?
Allegedly, this interaction has occurred since, man was a simian creature. And, there were genetic alterations made.
How specifically did the briefings detail how the aliens manipulated our genetics over the centuries?
It mentioned 65 or 63 corrections or additions to the genetic makeup that finally resulted in, a human creature.